Hello BookTube. My goal here is to make a very short video about a short poem. Speaking for myself, and I know for some of my close friends as well, there's a sense that we're currently living through very dark times, historically speaking and politically speaking. And this video is sort of addressed to that anxiety. If you don't feel that anxiety, then this video and the poem that I'm going to read probably won't speak to you. As dark as things look now, politically, historically speaking, it's not hard to find a time in recent history, recent memory, which was probably much darker, much darker. The date is September 1st, 1939, and Hitler has just invaded Poland, kicking off World War II, which, as we know, with historical perspective, is one of the most grotesque, horrific historical calamities, possibly of the existence of our entire species, of all of human history. A really unassimilable catastrophe. And a poet, W.H. Auden, is sitting in a bar in New York City, and he pens a verse. He writes a poem. And it's a poem that articulates his anxieties about the future and speaks to this question of how do we cope? How do we make sense of these terrible trends in politics, in history? One of the things that's interesting about this poem is that Auden would come to disown this poem, to disavow this poem. He hated this poem. And that's really interesting to me. Of course, these kind of aesthetic determinations are not really up to the poet. They're up to the reader to make. We get to decide whether or not it's a good poem, not Auden. But at the same time, it's understandable, I think, why. In many ways, I think it's fair to say that this poem feels sort of beneath what Auden is capable of. Auden's poem is famous for being very cerebral, very dense and rich, very abstract, hard to decode. And this poem is much more straightforward in a lot of ways. It feels a bit didactic compared to the poems that he was happier with. And I think Auden would agree with the sentiment, which I generally agree with, that great poetry shouldn't really be didactic. But interestingly, for the same reasons that Auden really did not like this poem and did not want it anthologized, it's one of his most famous poems, and it's one of his most beloved poems, because it's accessible and it speaks to a certain rawness of emotion. It speaks to a really unfiltered voice. And of course, I think there's obviously a place for that in poetry, and I think people gravitate towards this poem for that exact reason. So we're going to try to run through this poem now. In the first stanza, we get a really beautiful, a really poetic description of the kind of anxieties, the kind of fear that Auden is dealing with now as World War II is opening in Europe. Quote, "I sit in one of the dives on 52nd Street, uncertain and afraid, as the clever hopes expire of a low, dishonest decade. Waves of anger and fear circulate over the bright and darkened lands of the earth, obsessing our private lives. The unmentionable odor of death offends the September night." End quote. And that's a stanza that resonates with me when things seem to be spiraling out of control, politically and historically speaking. The language of uncertain and afraid, and waves of anger and fear circulating over the bright, darkened lands of the earth, obsessing our private lives. I love that. Okay. The next stanza, Auden is going to address himself to the character and to the biography of Adolf Hitler, although not by name. And he's going to address the question, what makes an Adolf Hitler? Here we go. Quote, accurate scholarship can unearth the whole offence, from Luther until now, that has driven a culture mad. Find what occurred at Linz. Linz is where Hitler grew up. What huge imago made a psychopathic god. I and the public know what all school children learn. Those to whom evil is done do evil in return. End quote. I love this stanza. I love this last line. In moments of fear, in moments when we're grappling with the cruelty of human beings, the cruelty of the world, Auden says, scholarship can trace the path of, what happened to get to this point in history, but what we all know, what all school children know, those to whom evil is done do evil in return. The cycles of violence, the cycles of abuse, the cycles of trauma. And now in Auden's way, which is often by referencing external texts, external characters, he's going to give us a stanza about demagoguery and the reality of demagoguery, which is, of course, is what he's describing, the rise of fascism in Europe. Quote, exiled Thucydides knew all that a speech can say about democracy and what dictators do. The elderly rubbish they talk, to an apathetic grave, analyzed all in his book, the enlightenment driven away, the habit-forming pain, mismanagement and grief. We must suffer them all again. End quote. From the ancient Greeks, the Greek historian Thucydides, even he understood the capacity for democracy to fail to demagogues. And Auden says that's what we're witnessing now. The next stanza, we get one of Auden's great juxtapositions. He loves to juxtapose different images together. Quote, into this neutral air where blind skyscrapers use their full height to proclaim the strength of collective man, each language pours its vain, competitive excuse. But who can live for long in a euphoric dream? Out of the mirror they stare, imperialism's face, and the international wrong. End quote. That's a very dense, sort of abstract, Auden-esque stanza. But those two images, the collective strength of modern man and imperialism's face that he juxtaposes, I think is very compelling. Another stanza about the experience of living through troubled times, of living through troubled history, crazy history, what it feels like. Quote, faces along the bar cling to their average day. The lights must never go out. The music must always play. All the conventions conspire to make this fort assume the furniture of home, lest we should see where we are. Lost in a haunted wood, children afraid of the night, who have never been happy or good. End quote. Auden says it's these moments of terror where we realize what we are. We are just children afraid of the night. Children in a haunted wood. That's what this world is. Now we get another powerful juxtaposition and really one of my favorite Auden stanzas. A really gorgeous stanza. Quote, the windiest militant trash important persons shout is not so crude as our wish. What mad Nijinsky wrote about Diaghilev is true of the normal heart. For the error bred in the bone of each woman and each man craves what it cannot have, not universal love, but to be loved alone. End quote. And Auden is the master of pulling these external sources, these external quotes. He does it in a lot of his great poetry. And he's quoting this, it's like an amazing reference to Mad Nijinsky, who's like this, I learned about him obviously through the poem, this famous Russian dancer who had schizophrenia and was, institutionalized. And he wrote these like notebooks. But the point is that we want to be loved as individuals. We don't want universal love. The windiest militant trash important person shout being contrasted with this truism of human nature. We're all living these individual lives, and at the end of the day, all of politics is composed of individual human beings living individual lives who just want to be loved. And if this poem was not about politics and was not about World War II, but just had this line about, quote, what Mad Nijinsky wrote is true of the normal heart. Each woman and each man craves what it cannot have, not universal love, but to be loved alone. That would be a haunting line for me. We're getting towards the end here. Quote, from the conservative dark into the ethical light, the dense commuters come, repeating their morning vow. I will be true to the wife. I'll concentrate more on my work. And helpless governors wake to resume their compulsory game. Who can release them now? Who can reach the deaf? Who can speak to the dumb? End quote. This is a technique that Auden uses a lot, and it's a wonderful technique in my opinion. He uses it in The Fall of Rome, for example, where you get voices. You get voices of individuals who are living in this circumstance, living in this context. And in this case, it's the voice of the people repeating, I will be true to the wife. I'll concentrate more on my work. It's just the question of where you put the camera, and Auden is playing this game with us of contrasting the dramatic historical time, the historical processes that are unfolding with the human time, with the existential experience of a single human life, which is so delicate and in many ways so mundane and so petty and so trivial. But of course, that's all we have. The last two stanzas. Here we go. Quote, all I have is a voice to undo the folded lie, the romantic lie in the brain of the sensual man in the street, and the lie of authority whose buildings grope the sky. There is no such thing as the state, and no one exists alone. Hunger allows no choice to the citizen or the police. We must love one another or die. End quote. And this is, I think, the most clear example of why Auden did not like this poem. I think it's beautiful. I think a lot of people find it a very compelling stanza, a very beautiful stanza, but it is preachy. It is didactic. It is a little bit sermonizing. Auden is saying, I am the poet, and it's my job to speak the truth, to undo the folded lie, and to tell everyone this truth about universal humanity, the importance of love. Edward Mendelssohn, in his book, Later Auden, addresses this stanza. Quote, Auden had recently learned how easily a reader could modify the words of a poem to serve purposes its author despised. As early as 1944, he had abandoned the stanza in September 1st, 1939 that ended, "We must love one another or die." This line was more widely quoted and admired than perhaps anything else in his work. E.M. Forster said that because Auden had written it, he can command me to follow it. But Auden knew this was not what he had meant, and knew he had written it in the context of a poem in which he argued that love was not a moral choice, but a determined impersonal drive, like hunger. And hunger allows no choice to the citizen or the police. This reduction of love to instinct had seemed hateful to him for more than 20 years, and he was left with the guilty feeling that he had unintentionally deceived readers into praising him for a vaguely inspiring sentiment he had never wanted to express. Between you and me, he told a critic in 1957, I loathe that poem. End quote. The last stanza. Quote, defenseless under the night, our world in stupor lies, yet dotted everywhere ironic points of light flash out wherever the just exchange their messages. May I, composed like them, of eros and of dust, beleaguered by the same negation and despair, show an affirming flame. End quote. Us human beings, we're just composed of dust. We're beleaguered. We're defenseless under the night. And all we can do is show an affirming flame. All we could do is stand by our values and try to be a force of good in the world. And it's that call to courage and that vision of defiance that he uses to end the poem. Thanks for watching.